Hello, and welcome to the World Built Environment Forum webinar series. Today, we're going to be discussing blockchain's role in the circular economy within the built environment. My name is John Krause, and I'm Director, External Affairs at RICS. Now, the ability to track and prove provenance is a key aspect of the circular economy. So today, we'll be asking whether transparency that blockchain offers can improve the process and lead to greater sustainability in the built environment. And we've got a group of leading experts with us today. I'm going to introduce them one by one and ask them to explain what their role is. So firstly, Kevin O'Grady, Associate Director at Arup.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kevin O'Grady, and thanks to the RICS for this opportunity to come in and speak to you today. My background, just to give a history about myself, I'm a QS by background, working in Arup's aviation and business advisory. So that deals with commercial activities, procurement, cost planning, due diligence, and also doing life cycle costing. Well, that life cycle costing sort of looks to keep the asset and materials at their highest possible value for as long as possible, so really tying in well with the circular economy. I'm also regional chair for Fabri, which is a blockchain free to enter committee.
Thank you, Kevin. And secondly, Dr. Yingli Wang, Senior Lecturer at the Cardiff Business School at Cardiff University.
Hello, everyone. I'm a senior lecturer at Cardiff Business School, so I specialize in supply chain digitalization. So all my research is related to the digital technologies and their applications in supply chains. So I have been looking at blockchain for quite a few years now. I'm currently working with, for instance, World Economic Forum on how to redesign a supply chain that's built on blockchain, and also work with, of course, quite a few construction companies and fintech companies to look at its wide kind of application in the UK. So I'm particularly interested in looking at the integrative use of blockchain with other technology, other digital technologies.
Thank you, Yingli. And thirdly, Alex Bardell, who's founder at SD Advocate.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for letting me talk today. Yes, so my name's Alex Bardell, and I've come to where I am today after spending in the region of about 20 years working for big technology companies and consultancy companies. And my role is a technology enterprise architect. I design computer systems by trade. But about 2 years ago, some of the work I've been doing with the British Computer Society Green IT elective brought me face to face with the reality of technology waste and how the circular economy can help us improve things. And so what we do then in SD Advocate is start looking at how can we make our technology more sustainable using the circular economy, and also how can technology enable other industries and other lines of business to improve how they actually go about allocating resources.
Thank you, Alex. So we're going to start the discussion by turning over to you, the participants, and asking you a question. So you'll be seeing an online poll coming up now. And the question we're asking you is, in your organization, how frequently are clients and customers asking about the use of the circular economy? And you'll see a number of options there. Please just select one very quickly, and we will let you know the answers as soon as we can.
Hello?
Okay, so what we're seeing in the answers there is that probably something like 15% of people say their clients and customers are asking them about circular economy, 17% sometimes, and the rest, which is the vast majority, something like 70%, are saying rarely or never. So an interesting view there on how much the circular economy is part of your business conversations. So I'm just going to ask our panelists quickly to respond to that. What do you make of those results, Kevin?
I suppose it's part of our part of our remit to try and raise the awareness of circular economy, and sort of webinars like this are very good at doing that. We need to raise the awareness in the industry that the positive outcomes from circular economy, and looking at decoupling business growth from the negative impacts. So hopefully through this webinar, we'll explain some of the advantages of thinking about circular economy at an early design stage.
Yingli, were you surprised by those results? Not hearing.
Hi, sorry, I was just muting myself. Not much so. I think this is understandable because a lot of our colleagues in industries, they deal with their day-to-day work and may not necessarily be aware of the current developments in this space. So hopefully through this webinar, they'll become more informed, and therefore they can start to think about how they should be going about doing embracing this technology, and also more widely think how circular economy could be, some of the new business models could be embedded in their day-to-day operations.
Thank you, and we'll come on to business models as part of this conversation later on. So I just want to turn to Kevin now to give us an idea of what is the circular economy and why is it important to sustainability in the built environment. I'm going to show a graphic with the kind permission of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which Kevin is going to take us through.
Thank you very much. So back in 2016, Arup became a global knowledge partner for the built environment.
Sorry, if we can just ask people to go on mute when they're not speaking. Thank you, Kevin.
Perfect. So back in 2013, Arup became a global knowledge partner for the built environment with Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and the foundation used this diagram. It's called the butterfly diagram, and it's used to sort of see how resources move through the circular economy. So trying to keep assets and materials at their highest possible value for as long as possible. So if we look at this diagram, you've got the green on the left and the blue on the right. The green on the left looks at biological cycles, but in the built environment, we're more looking at the technical cycles, which are on the right-hand side of the diagram. So when products come into the built environment, they'll come through the manufacturer, through product manufacturers, through service providers, until they're actually used on site. So we're in the user on site part of the diagram. And the loops on the actual diagram are sort of drawn deliberately because the shorter the loop, the less energy and potentially more profit you can gain from trying to keep within certain loops on your project. So if it's designed, so if we use a steel beam for an example, a steel beam when it's actually in use, if we can reuse the building as it is in the smallest loop there, the share and the sort of maintain and prolonging loop, we can actually reuse that at the highest profit value for the end user. If we can't use it in its current position, if it can't stay on the building, we have to relocate to another location. Well, that still gives a profit because you don't have to buy that material. It's better for the environment. There's less reusing and energy to move it to another location. If we can't use it to other location, we have to adapt that steel in some form or other. There's energy required to do that. So you're moving out to the reuse, redistribute circle. Gives you less profit and less use of in the circular economy, and then to the outer scale of the loop, if that steel beam has to be resmelted down and redistributed, you can see that that gives you the less, but it's still a very good part of the circular economy. To actually recycle parts of the building is still very much a good part of circular economy, but there's many other levels that we should be looking at when we design building for deconstruction, and thinking about the reuse of materials is very important. And I think that's where the blockchain element will come into this, because in order to use a material, say in 50, 60 years time, which is sort of like the average building use, we would want to track that material And blockchain has a good way of provenance and actually tracking that through right the way through the life cycle of a project. And sort of the last bit, just to sort of emphasize, is obviously that circular economy does focus on diverting waste from landfill. And in our designs, we should be trying as best as possible to divert materials from landfill, because going forward in the future, we know that taxes on any materials that go to landfill will increase, because the materials are becoming more and more scarce. We have to be more frugal with the actual materials we have and make them last longer. And that's sort of like the summary of what is the circular economy. I suppose the next part is why is that important, I suppose, and that is that going to be open up to the floor, or do you want me to go for that? Okay.
So thank you. A great overview there. So things around how we need to use resources sensibly because of increased resource scarcity, and also looking at the financial aspects, perhaps taxation around landfill use, and indeed the cost of energy in transforming materials. So we'll come into that in a bit more detail with the subsequent questions. I want to turn now to why is blockchain actually relevant to the circular economy? How is blockchain going to help? So we'll assume a certain knowledge of blockchain amongst our listeners and participants today, and we have looked at blockchain in previous webinars, which are available on the World Built Environment Forum website. But in summary, blockchain is a list of records, i.e. data, known as blocks. These blocks can grow. They are connected using encryption technology. And for every transaction that you conduct using the blockchain, you find there are multiple copies of the audit trail. And so this leads to a high level of assurance and certainty about what the true state of a set of data or a transaction is. The uses of blockchain, as I'm sure some of you will know, distributed ledgers for cryptocurrencies. You've heard of Ethereum, you've heard of Bitcoin. Smart contracts, which allow you to execute contracts without direct human intervention. The music sharing industry, video industry, looking at use of the blockchain. But our focus today is really how blockchain is going to have a direct impact on the supply chain in the built environment. So that's the basis for knowledge of what blockchain is. How are we going to use it in the circular economy? Ying Li, what do you say to that? Or Alex, if Ying Li isn't there.
Okay. So I start. So the check. Oh, so Ying Li's back.
Hello. Hi. John, I think you summarized really well about what blockchain is and what it can do. Basically, if you look at its typical its key attributes and what differentiates from blockchain from the other databases, because it has quite a few unique ability that other databases, distributed databases, tend not to have. For instance, because it is distributed, therefore it allows every participant to see what is going on. So we have this what I tend to call it parallel visibility about a particular transaction, for instance. And this transparency is one of the casing for product provenance in the circular economy. So if we try to manage a particular piece of material that goes into a building, for instance, and we want to manage and follow its footprint from the beginning to the end, and hopefully close the loop and see it going through the cycle again. So we need to know exactly what it is, when it goes into where, and also who has ownership of that. And the blockchain would enable you to do that. So this is one big case of blockchain in circular economy is product provenance and traceability. The other thing that would be useful for as a blockchain potential use case is this peer-to-peer trading concept. So we start to see quite a few new platforms emerge that would facilitate the energy trading, for instance. If you have solar power, if you have oversupply, then you can start to sell your electricity to your neighbors, for instance. And that can be facilitated through a blockchain enabled platform. At the moment, it's not mainstream yet, but we start to see a lot of development efforts going into that. I think the third use case that for me, why blockchain is relevant to circular economy is this smart contract, John, you have just mentioned. With smart contract, you can program certain terms into a blockchain, and the terms will be executed automatically. So we can talk about automatic payment. If, for instance, if one piece of material is being delivered by the supplier on site, is being deployed, and then that fulfills term, then the supplier, you will get automatic payment rather than waiting for, let's say, for a number of days for the payment to clear. And also there are other type of payment terms between peers, what we call peer-to-peer payment. For instance, if we think in the context of Internet of Things, and we start to see that a lot of Internet of Things, they start to feed the data into, for instance, the blockchain, and then the smart contract would start to act on that. Depends on what kind of terms that you program into that. One of the examples we start to see in automotive, for instance, is those autonomous electric vehicle. They would charge themselves in a charging station, and then they would use their own digital wallet to pay for the electricity they used. So it's machine-to-machine payment. We start to see it popping up as well. So there are many other use cases. I think in the context of circular economy, from my perspective, I think that's where we see most of the efforts are currently concentrating.
So a lot there about the provenance of materials, their ownership, peer-to-peer trading, even machine payment.
Yeah.
Alex, from your background, what do you see as the relevance of blockchain?
So one of the challenges, supply chains get very complicated very quickly. So my environment is compute. So if you take a computer, once you start each of the components out, there's a supply chain associated with each and every component. And we've wanted to try and map supply chains for a long time, but it's just very difficult from a technology perspective to do it with a centralized system. So what blockchain is saying, okay, now we have a distributed ledger. We can then distribute it off to any component element of the supply chain. We can branch, just like we branch software and branch off to different supply chains. And what the possibility offers is effectively an infinite chain of parts that we can monitor and manage. So the real benefit of blockchain over some of our previous software elements we've had available to us is it's giving us that possibility to start trying to understand the very, very complicated and difficult, which is that supply chains are complex, they go around the world, they're really, really distributed. And without something like this, it becomes very, very difficult to try and actually manage and track it. And up to now, honestly, we haven't been particularly successful. So the concept of the circular economy has been around for a while. But unless we can actually execute against it and understand what each step of the supply chain is, and hold the data information about each step, it then becomes very difficult up till now for us to actually realistically manage the complete end-to-end supply chain.
So a lot there about complexity and how blockchain can help us deal with complexity, but even for us to get there, we've got to find a way of managing that complexity before we start to use the blockchain. So it's starting to become almost a circular problem, I suppose you might say. I want to open up now a further poll question before we extend the debate. And the question that we're going to ask you now is, and it will be popping up on your screen, is do you think that your organization will implement blockchain for the circular economy? So you've heard a bit about what blockchain can do. Do you think your organization is going to pick it up for the purposes of the circular economy? While you're thinking about that, I'll just point out there is the ability to enter questions individually through the online platform, which we'll be able to pick up either during the conversation or towards the end when we have some Q&A time. So I'm going to close the poll now and say what the results have been. Well, what we're seeing is that nobody has already implemented blockchain for these purposes. Only 16% say probably or definitely. A lot of uncertainties, 58% of respondents saying they're just not sure, and 25% saying probably not. So I think basically what we're seeing there, a lot of uncertainty mixed with skepticism at this stage about using blockchain in your businesses. So let me hand that over then and pass that perhaps to Kevin to talk a little bit about the challenges, because Kevin, you've actually been looking at the sorts of approaches that blockchain can help with in your day-to-day business. So how are you seeing the practical implementation of blockchain?
Yeah, we had a hackathon in our offices a couple of months ago, and we looked at many different user cases, but we aren't seeing at the moment that sort of uptake within the construction industry so much. We saw olive growers, a cooperation of olive growers where there's 150 in a cooperative, and they use blockchain to track where the olives came from back to the shop front. So I think it can be done, and it can be done at sort of at local levels or company levels, but sort of taking it back to the construction industry, sort of designers, contractors and suppliers know, and they're aware of provenance of materials in construction for maybe quality purposes, health and safety purposes, material standards, sustainability. So we all know, obviously, the reason why we need provenance. Maybe the Grenfell Tower was one in 2017. Being able to track that cladding panels back to the origin would have been very helpful at the time to track that back where they come from. So within the construction industry, if we can track the provenance of materials right the way through from when they leave the factory, we can embed data such as the fabrication specification, designer specification, transportation details, and if we've got the transportation and the energy used to produce that steel, we can embed in the steel its carbon footprint for use later on. And it's in sort of summary, we all know the value of service records, and when we purchase cars, we know that a logbook and a service record helps increase the value of our car. We just need to translate that knowledge of having a logbook and a service record for our assets in the built environment, and it's that sort of translation down to sort of user level, that if you can understand that it will increase the value of your asset. And we wouldn't look to sell a car without a logbook and a service record. And I think I truly believe that in time that all assets will have a digital record, because people are aware that will increase their value.
Thank you, Kevin. A whole range of ideas there. Yingli, what's your response? And in particular, what do you think about this idea of almost a logbook for buildings, a passport for buildings? How realistic is that?
I think I quite agree with Kevin that this is a very important concept that's going to become a reality for many assets, particularly asset intensive sectors. Now we started to see this concept of digital passport and digital identity, and this has been started to, a lot of researchers are started to develop in this, and also many organizations start to look into this, because in a circular economy, if you want to manage the whole life cycle of a particular material or particular asset, you want to know what goes into it, and in what state. You want to know, for instance, because blockchain gives you time stamp, and this is very important function. It enables you to know at what time that what things has gone into that particular asset, or what things has been done to that particular kind of asset. Now, this whole product provenance and traceability is not just unique in the circular economy, in the building environment. If we start to look at the development elsewhere, for instance, in the food sector, Walmart has mandated all its leafy vegetable suppliers to append the data onto their blockchain by September this year, and this signals a larger scale up deployment in the food sector. They have very good reasons to do that, because this is very good. This is a very good application for those food retailers, because they want to know if things go wrong, there is a safety issue, and they can recall the product quickly. They can trace the product quickly. So there is a health and safety issues associated with that. And we talked about previously, if you want to track a particular item or ingredient in a finished product, it may take weeks, if not days, to do that. But with blockchain enabled traceability, and we talk about a few seconds. Now, this is a big difference. Of course, in the circular economy, we have the longer, much longer kind of loop that we need to follow. We talk about a lot of products. They may have their life for more than 100 years, but the underlying principle is the same. And so this in the future, I believe this is going to be inevitable for the built environment to pick up on this, and for each asset to have their own identity, digital identity. There are concepts like digital twins and things already being discussed. I think everybody probably know about that. It's not mainstream yet, but I think we're getting there, particularly if that integrates with building information modeling type of technology as well.
Wonderful. Thank you. I just want to bring in Yingli, if you could go on mute at that point.
Okay.
Thank you. I just want to bring in Alex for a word there. And Alex, just an additional question for you. All this blockchain, doesn't this really mean a massive increase in the use of the global demand on power? So, we hear about Bitcoin consuming all the electricity of a medium-sized country. Is that where we're headed with blockchain?
Well, so one of the challenges with blockchain now is, you're right, it's very resource hungry. I think it currently takes about 15 seconds to process a block in the chain, so that's only 4 blocks a minute. That's not really going to be performant enough for the sort of things we're talking about. And I think we need to look at, we have to be realistic. Where are we today with blockchain? And there's this wonderful thing called the Gartner's hype cycle. And I looked at the 2019 one, and there's this whole hype of something new coming along, and it's wonderful. And then we have this thing called the trough of disillusionment, which is we need to get the technology to a point in time where it's fit for purpose. And then there's the period of enlightenment where we can actually start taking it on, and it becomes relevant. And Gartner's saying that we're probably 5 to 10 years away from having a sort of a blockchain that looks a bit like social media, or looks like cloud computing, or something like that. And it's just that the original open source code was released 10 years ago now, and it's only in the last 2 or 3 years that people are really starting to invest time. There's money being spent on developing the capabilities. There are organizations who are starting to deliver blockchain platforms that you in the building trade can consume, because you don't want to be a blockchain development house. You want to be a construction company, and you want to consume blockchain. You don't want to be building it from scratch. And so I think it's quite early days. And Kevin was right when he talks about some of the user cases. Most of the user cases now are quite simple. They're little collectives, they're olive trees, they're orange juice supply chains from Dutch supermarkets. They're relatively simple implementations of blockchain. And I think that the challenge is that we shouldn't really overhype this. It's going to take time. It's going to take a while for it to become more mature. It's going to take time for people to develop the software to a level that it's fit for purpose. And we can't expect too much. And so realistically, the reason why the feedback says that lots of people on your call are not considering blockchain yet is because it's quite early in its life cycle, and it needs that adoption, and it needs investment, and it needs organizations, and it also needs proper implementation before it becomes the next cloud computing, or the next .com, or the next big digital element.
Thank you, Alex. I think that point about the critical mass is important. We'll come back to that in a moment. I want to ask now, very practical terms, how, if I'm in an organization and I want to start implementing blockchain for my products, for my purchases that I may wish to make, for my projects, what are some of the things I could actually start to do now with the technology that's available now that I would start to gain a competitive advantage from? And again, I'll turn to Kevin first on that.
Thank you. I suppose if I look at the fridge analogy, before they had the A to E quality rating on the fridge, everyone used to purchase fridges maybe just on the name of the brand, maybe, or on price. So the data that we had available for making decisions was either cost or brand. When we started being presented with the data of A to E, you knew that if you brought an E-rated fridge, that you'll probably pay far more electricity in time. So as a manufacturer or a service provider, if you can provide and embed the data to your audience or your clients that you are selecting a A-rated or a B-rated product, this at the procurement stage will put you a definite advantage. We certainly know now we've been presented with the data on a fridge about A to E. They don't make fridges below C-rated because people don't buy them. So it's providing data to your client, and we're seeing the same in the industry where providers of quality products are keen for people to assess at tender stage based on the quality of their product. So from a designer's point of view, if we could request EPD data, the environmental product data from suppliers and supply chain, and that information is used at the qualification stage, you wouldn't select a product necessarily on cost alone. You have the data from which to make a more informed decision, and the quality of the product sometimes is hidden in these tender returns by cost. It's like the race to the bottom. Everyone's going to go for the cheapest option, and that may not be the cheapest option over the life cycle of your building. So having the data at early design stage helps you make informed decisions to make sure you're looking at quality as well as cost.
Thank you, Kevin. Alex, what would you advise someone that's asking you the question, what can I do right now with blockchain that would make a difference to my business?
I think you need to ask yourself the question, do you want to be a blockchain developer? And if you want to be the blockchain supplier to the build industry, well, then you need to think about how you would construct your platform. But I guess the majority of the people here would say, actually, we want to consume blockchain. So what you should really start thinking about is, what do you want to do? You want to write down your requirements, and you need to find somebody who will then provide you the service that you can then consume back again. And I think some really useful lessons is that in the early days of adoption, some of the big starters right at the beginning of something aren't necessarily there towards the end. And we've learned some important lessons in cloud, which is when you go in to build yourself a cloud service and consume a cloud service, you really need to think about, if this company is not here, how do I get out of my contract and how do I get my data back? You don't want to be the guy standing at the data center when a cloud service provider went out of business saying, my data is sitting on those disks in there. So you really need to think about, okay, so you're probably not going to be a blockchain developer. You're not going to develop your own blockchain solutions. You need someone who will provide you the blockchain platform. And what you do is you add your own intellectual capital on top, and you manage and control your data underneath. And it becomes a procurement process. So you really need to be careful about how you procure those services, what are the kind of contracts you have written in place, and who owns the intellectual capital associated with it, so that if there's a problem and you decide to go to a different blockchain vendor at some time in the future, or your blockchain vendor ceases to be the number one and there's someone else who can do a better job, you have that ability to pick up all of your software and all of your data and plop it somewhere else, and therefore avoid some of the pain and suffering that people have gone through in the adoption of cloud.
Okay, thank you. So some words of caution there, really, about due diligence on the blockchain supplier and what happens to your data if, for any reason, that supplier it no longer exists in the future. Ying Li, do people ask you this question? Are you
Um,
saying?
y- yes, I think from a supply chain perspective, if we look at about blockchain implementation, the first thing I would always, when I speak to industrial colleagues is to think whether you would need blockchain at the first instance or not. And many would think blockchain would be a silver bullet, but in many cases it is not. So normally what you do is either you have some existing problems in your supply chain in this circular economy that you think the blockchain can help with, or you see new business opportunities that arise from the use of blockchain. So either way, you need to you select a entry point to the supply chain. So you don't do the blockchain for the sake of doing it. You really have to think about the value creation from it. So what sort of value do you expect by implementing blockchain that you would gain? And also in blockchain, it's particularly useful when it comes to inter-organization collaboration. So you need to think about, who would be in your blockchain ecosystem if you want to be part of a a big consortium, or do you want to take a lead to create something that you would then pull other people in, other organizations in? So you need to think about this, this blockchain network concept rather than you do it on your own. I doubt you very much, because there are concepts like enterprise blockchain, but at the moment, where the value is where you can bring in multiple supply chain stakeholders into that ecosystem, and therefore you could create a platform that delivers value. And the other thing that people often forget about is to think about the governance model. Most of the blockchain use case in a supply chain context is that they use permissioned blockchain. That means the access is controlled. It's not open to the public. Not everybody can join it. So even within that permissioned blockchain, you still need to think about how you're going to govern the blockchain, given that it's decentralized and it does not have a centralized authority in there to try to control and coordinate things. So this governance issue is very important, and it's also very challenging. So you need to think about, how each participating members, if you have decided who should be part of this ecosystem, you need to think about how you should interact with each other. And you need to clearly define the ways by which companies can access or exit a blockchain network, and the type of roles and responsibilities each member will play, and also what would happen and how should you do what should you do when potential disputes and conflicts arise. So this is another thing that's very important to think about when you go about implementing blockchain. The other thing I want to bring to your attention is you have to think about the legal implications, particularly in the context of smart contract. So there are a number of unique legal matters that emerge from the blockchain's distributed nature. And blockchain also can, many blockchain cases are currently in the global kind of scale. So they cannot be shut down. If we talk about open blockchain, permissionless blockchain, they cannot be shut down by any one legal system. And they exist outside the boundaries of many conventional laws, etc. So you need to think about the legal implications as well. In terms of whether you go for permissioned or permissionless supply chain, and you really need to think about the actual business problem or the business opportunity you want to grasp, and then you go from there. Yeah, that's
Thank you, Yuli. I think that there's a whole range of issues there that I think is really important. And this idea of, how do you deal with conflicts and disputes? What's the legal underpinning and so on, the governance around it? That's probably another webinar in itself. And you touched on there, I think, the inter-organizational aspect. So I want to move on to a further question. Ying Li, while you've got the microphone, I'd like to say, picking up on a point you were making there about interoperability in organizations and multiple stakeholders, do we need some sort of critical mass for the use of blockchain before it really becomes valuable to the economy? And if so, what is that critical mass? How do we get to it? What do you think about that?
Um, we do need critical mass, and it is a typical there is a typical pattern for any type of technological diffusion. So at the very early stage, you see a couple of companies, the pioneers and the early movers, and then they started to demonstrate the advantages and benefits that you can gain from the particular technological innovation. And in this case, blockchain, there are many pioneers at the moment. But in terms of large-scale deployment, we're yet there. We're not quite there yet, but think it will take a few years' time. So in between, many companies wouldn't want to just wait and see. If they do see the opportunity, and then they would, they would normally start with a pilot, start from a small scale, more kind of independent, isolated kind of environment, and to test out some of the concepts, and then roll it out at a larger scale. So this is typical path that's being followed through. In terms of how to build a critical mass, and that's quite similar. If you look at, when internet was commercialized back to the late 1994, and then we started to see a lot of open marketplace, basically equivalent to the permissionless blockchain at the moment. And then we see a lot of companies, the internet bubble bursted in the early 2000s. And then later on, we started to see a lot of closed, like consortium-based efforts going into that. We see a lot of permissioned type of, closed type of internet-enabled platform that come into being, and they lasted for much longer, and they are still at the moment, I think, dominate a lot of B2B, business-to-business, interorganizational communication. And I strongly believe, and we're going to see a similar kind of pattern in the deployment of blockchain. So we have Bitcoin, we have Ethereum, all those open marketplaces, and they are at the frontiers in terms of technological development. They're pushing the boundary, etc. But in terms of the use case and applications in circular economy and in supply chain in general, we will start to see a few companies take lead. They will be what I call the supply chain orchestrator. For instance, if you look at Walmart in the food, you can look at Maersk shipping line in shipping, you look at a few big OEMs in automotive, and they started to push this through. And this is how they gather build the critical mass, because they are kind of in a very good position to pull in the resources, to pull in other organizations from supply chain to participate. And this is how you build your critical mass. If you use open blockchain and many internet marketplace in their early days, they suffer from this egg and chicken and egg problem. So you would want people to use that, but then you would have to demonstrate there are sufficient people to use it. But then, this is a vicious circle. If you don't have sufficient people to use it, and you can't persuade other people to join. So one way to, get away from that negative circle is some of the lead organizations take the initiative and push this forward, pull in a number of other supply chain actors into this, and then they tend to be a consortium-based kind of initiative. And if they demonstrate that well, and then the critical mass will be achieved, and within specific sectors, we talk about vertical sectors here, and then hopefully in the future, we will see cross-sector, horizontal kind of blockchain development. If you look at, for instance, the historical internet-based platforms, we have Elemica, that's very big in chemical industry. We also have, for instance, a very big platform-based systems in the shipping sector, and similar ones in automotive, Kobe Center, etc. And they all by gathering, by pulling in those supply chain actors, those big players in those sectors were able to establish the critical mass. That's the bottom-up kind of approach. And also, I also think the blockchain is really a team effort, and we need all different kinds of stakeholders, not just supply chain actors. We talk about the government needs to invest in research development, need to keep an eye on the law policies to support and safeguard and incentivize deployment of blockchain. And we need the standard organizations to develop standards and facilitate interoperability issues. We also need the technology service providers to tackle some of those technical bottlenecks that we are currently seeing. We also, of course, need professional bodies such as RICS to address the skills gap and the training need. So it needs a concerted effort to get this critical mass. I think we will get there.
It's a big agenda, and led perhaps by these bigger companies coming in, shipping sector and automotive sector. You mentioned the need for government incentives, policies, standards and interoperability where professional bodies might be able to help. From your perspective, Alex, where do you see the critical mass if we're going to get there? Where do you see that coming from?
Well, I think it's got to be driven by a market. I mean, if you look at from the dot-com boom, companies like Amazon and Google, there's a clear market, a clear business model, and a clear way to generate revenue. And there's no getting away from the fact that for a technology to be successful, it needs investment. And if you look at the amount of investment that went into dot-com, it was quite a lot. There was a lot of money that's needed to get from a sort of conceptual open source platform to something which is a real stable market force that's performant, that's secure, that meets all the criteria, and clearly needs to deliver against the business need. Now, in my 20 years of working in technology, I've seen things come and go. Some things which are really, really good ideas that have never really materialized, and it's just because there was never a market for those products. So if you were thinking about blockchain, you're thinking about how this is relevant for the build industry, I think you've really got to thinking about where's the business case and how's that business case going to deliver value to, at the end of the day, the investors who are going to be spending their money to develop these platforms, to deliver these services, and they expect a return on that investment. And unfortunately, it's not all about the technology. It's about trying to identify a clearly defined market for that technology and understanding how that market is going to generate revenue for the people who are prepared to invest in it. And if it doesn't do that, it unfortunately probably will go the way of lots of very clever, smart technology platforms, which they remain a niche, or they just die along the way.
Thank you, Alex. And that brings us, I think, very neatly to our final question that we prepared, which is what are the new business models? Because you're talking about, what is the extra value that can be brought by blockchain to a company, and so on. So if I could ask you very briefly, for each one of you, for one example, I'm going to start with Alex. If you could describe one new business model that's arising from blockchain, specifically preferably with a circular economy benefit, what's one new business model you can foresee?
So the business model I foresee is, obviously I work in the technology industry, and we develop probably about 60 million tons of electronic waste every year. Most of that waste goes to third world countries where it's either burnt, dumped, and some value components are taken out of it. So the business model for me is quite clear, and I think where you look at the Sustainable Development Goals that the United Nations are now promoting, it's going to be a carrot and a stick. There's value in all of this technology, and that value is just wasted. So blockchain has a business case there, which is, can we extract the value from old compute equipment? Can we recycle components we're not using anymore? Can we recycle rather than dump what is extremely valuable elements? I mean, computers are full of gold, they're full of rare earth metals, they're full of some very expensive components, a lot of which is just being dumped. So from that case, there is a clear business need that for us to get better in our data centers and our compute environment, we need to be able to recycle, we need to repurpose, we need to be able to reuse all of those components which go into the electrical systems. And the circular economy allows us to do that. And so there are companies now which take old laptops and they take old computers, they bring them back to the warehouse, they refurbish them, they send them back out again, and they've got another 3, 4, 5 years worth of life in them. Previously, we would have just dumped those. At best, they'd have been recycled. At worst, they'd have been shipped somewhere like Africa or China, where any valuable parts would be stripped out and the rest of them would just be dumped or burnt, causing very bad environmental damage. But the clear market driver is that we won't be able to do that anymore. There are ships that are sailing around the seas full of computer waste where they can't really put them anywhere, and people aren't accepting it. So what this provides is the opportunity is that there is a cost, and the cost associated with not having a circular vision for electronics is going to be placed on the people who have the components and placed on the manufacturers. And if there's a cost associated with it, well, then they're going to have to do something, and therefore that's driving the business case. And if we have the circular economy to do that, to completely cycle around, and we don't throw all our computers and mobiles away, we reuse them, and when we finish with them, we take those components out and we dispose of them properly. We take anything of value away from them, and anything of no value, we dispose of it properly. And if we're able to do that, well, then there's an absolute business case there, and I think that will drive the investment needed. And as we've already discussed, for the circular economy to function, we need something like blockchain underneath, with its ability to deliver infinite chains for us to understand where these components are and what they're doing and where they are in their life cycle. And so that's probably a driver for why we would want to use blockchain.
Thanks, Alex. So very much there about waste reduction, extracting the value, particularly in the electronics components sector and computing. A business model, Kevin, what would you see as a new business model, perhaps that Arup would be looking to implement?
Yeah, we're currently working on a construction smart contracts committee where we're actually doing a proof of concept, putting digital passports on assets and looking at the difference between business as usual and actually tagging and mapping assets. And some assets maybe we see as not as your traditional assets that the floor tiles, but because the duration of the project, it will go on to the life of the building. It's important that we do the blockchain proof of concept, which is checking that you've got security, where you've got multiple stakeholders changing hands, so different FM providers through the life of your building. You've got provenance, so over time you need to be able to track that back, and inside that blockchain would have all the EPD data from the actual product, and transparency. So I see that as, and we're already working on that sort of proof of concept to see how that can be used in the built environment. And once you know your asset at the end of building life, that really helps the circular economy for the reuse part.
Thank you, Kevin. And I finally want to turn to Ying Li for what you might see, Ying Li, as a business model. And just to throw in one of the questions we've had from one of the participants online, which is to say that blockchain seems to be a good way of dealing with individual components, but how do you use blockchain at a systems level? So for an entire building or entire group of buildings, are there business models we can evolve around that? Ying Li.
Okay, I'm not sure I get to understand the question properly, but does that mean is that the question is supposed to mean how we could deploy blockchain at a higher level other than individual component tracking and provenance? Is that the question?
So literally, verbatim, the question is, how does blockchain handle supply chains in aggregate? So if the blockchain is managing assets on a basis, how can this be implemented to understand the full inventory? While the specific unit is left behind.
Yeah, I understand that. In terms of because for the blockchain itself, many initiatives are still at the pilot stage. That's why we talk a lot about a particular type of product that goes into a finished product or goes into building. for instance. So that's because, you know, many organizations, when they were piloting this, they started with small things, because otherwise things get really complicated and you really can't manage the whole thing. That's why I mentioned earlier, it is very important to not to look at blockchain in isolation. So when you talk about the whole building, for instance, the whole car, and we talk about the hundreds and thousands of pieces we need to manage, and we need to look at the whole life cycle for every single ingredient. Also, we look at the whole product, the product as a whole. So you need to have, you know, this is a hierarchical level. You need to have the visibility for the whole building, a whole car, or you also need to be able to zoom in and to look at, you know, what is going on if, you know, with a particular, you know, piece of product or ingredient that goes into the finished product. And it's not in contradiction. And in many cases, it can be dealt with. I mean, I know some platforms about end-to-end visibility of supply chain. They're not on the blockchain, but they do give you the visibility at this hierarchical level. So you can zoom in and start to look at things. And then, you know, each supply chain actor would then append the data about what, you know, within their own, of course, within their own roles responsible within that particular supply chain. And then the data gets made visible based on, of course, you know, the access control, right? The particular added value about the blockchain is in that kind of traditional environment, people can still manipulate the data, but with blockchain, it's very hard, and you won't be able to manipulate the data once they get appended to the blockchain. So in the future, we will start to see a centralized, for instance, cloud-based platform that would then connect with the blockchain, a decentralized platform, and they would interact with each other. So the way I see it is a blockchain will start to feed data into those you know, existing platforms, and to kind of safeguard and to make sure that, you know, the information in those systems are validated and verified, and we know, for instance, if we talk about the model, we know exactly who did update, what was done, when it was done, etc. So you will see the blockchain start to interact with other models, and therefore you'll be able to see, you know, the bigger picture rather than just individual item provenance.
Thank you, Yang Li. It's a very interesting idea of how we connect the sort of centralized data, if you like, through sitting on a cloud with a decentralized system run through the blockchain. I think that's a lovely image for us to finish on. That's all we have time for today. I want to thank everybody that's joined us, and I want to thank in particular our panelists, Kevin O'Grady, Associate Director at Arup, Dr. Yingli Wang, Senior Lecturer at Cardiff Business School, Cardiff University, and last but by no means least, Alex Bardell, Founder at SD Advocate. We are going to put a poll up, so please take the opportunity to give us your feedback on what you thought of this webinar. We take that feedback very seriously and use it to shape our future webinars. So please do look at that and let us have your thoughts. Also, please take a look at the World Built Environment Forum website, where you will find details for our next webinar, and that's going to be on the topic of PropTech. What has changed in 12 months since we did our first PropTech webinar? And that's going to be on the 21st of August at 1600 to 1700 hours British Summer Time. And registration for that should be opening online tomorrow for anyone that's interested. So thank you once again to our experts. Thank you for signing off. I'm John Krause at RICS. And until next time, thank you.